If your engineering team is not using Claude Code, Codex, Cursor, any of these tools, like they're not going to be competitive.
Welcome to AI and PE, the future of value creation. I'm Kyle Romer, head of US Data and AI at Accordion. Today's episode is part of our series with Adam Silverman. Adam has been building custom AI tools since before most people knew what an AI agent was. He's tested over 500 leading agents, and more importantly, he sits at the rare intersection of deep, hands on AI expertise and the real practical needs of private equity. In this episode, I speak with Adam about what PE leaders actually need to know about AI right now. Let's get into it. Development costs and timelines are shrinking to build software and products, and it's shrunk so much. Like if you thought you were building it one way, 6 months ago, that's changed in the last 3 months with some of the new tooling and agents and LLMs. Adam, what are you seeing in terms of AI use in software development?
If your engineering team is not using Claude Code, Codex, Cursor, any of these tools, like they're not going to be competitive. And I think this, and as well, if like if you're working with consulting firms, if the teams behind the scenes aren't using them, you're kind of overpaying overall is something that I think more and more clients are going to start to realize. Um, it's really shrunken the timeline in terms of how long it takes to go and execute projects. I think from a prototyping perspective, the rate at which you can prototype is unprecedented. You can build truly amazing prototypes very quickly, and then productionizing those, engagements, what probably would have taken a year or 2 years sometimes to build out these full-fledged platforms can now be done in a matter of months. I think that the need for very skilled engineers, like the most kind of veteran engineers who have 20 plus years of software engineering is not going anywhere. These are the people who need to like learn how to actually like kind of control these systems because at the end of the day, you get so much code that gets generated. You need to have somebody who can parse through it, understand if it's truly logical, what it's coming up with. And this is something I think will continue to permeate. I think like a lot of like low level engineering tasks are going to be the first thing that get automated. But I really look at these types of tools as like the biggest empowerment for both like internal use cases. If there's like an internal use case you've been banging your head against, just go and try and see how far you can get, even if you're not an engineer with Claude Code. Um, and then for kind of outsourcing different work, I think you're going to see now, you know, within a quarter, you can really have like a huge, huge, huge impact within a company that otherwise would have never been possible.
I love this quote, Adam, from one of our lead engineers within the AI lab. She says, "Look, we're not handwriting any code anymore. We're effectively architecting and quality control for what agents are developing." And I just love the idea that the role of the senior engineer is evolving, and that experience is so important to get these products right.
We're 2 years into coding agents. Like, if we're gonna be talking February 2028, it's gonna be a total different world. It is really what I believe. I think that there is going to be more empowerment for everyone throughout the entire organization. So what you used to think, I have to go to a data analyst or I have to go to an engineer on our team to go and build out. I think every business user will have this type of functionality directly within their toolkit. And then for more complex applications, that's obviously where I think that's where you're still gonna need an engineering team to go build out solutions, but their speed is just gonna be unprecedented, and a lot of the work is going to be, maybe I've said this publicly before, but I have this take that I think people are gonna be spending as much as their salaries on LLM tokens every month. Or maybe it's on LLMs, maybe there's a new type of architecture that comes out by then. But I truly believe that, like, if you have an engineer who's getting paid, let's just say $20,000 a month, they might be spending $20,000 a month on these coding tools, but their productivity is gonna be the equivalent of, like, a 10 or 20 different engineers, at once. So this is like a very interesting paradigm. I think a lot of companies are trying to grapple with this right now. But it's an exciting time to think if you are thinking about this, you're in the right place because the companies that aren't are the ones that are gonna be kinda left behind in the coming decade.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. Well, look, when you take a step back, you look at like all these three themes or shifts, like what do they tell you about AI and private equity right now and where it's headed?
Overall, like, the more data, the better. I think if you think about these companies that have gotten these crazy valuations, Scale AI, Mercor, a bunch of these, other, like, companies that are providing training data to the labs, what you realize is, like, the more data you're capturing internally, that's the most valuable thing you can be doing. I listened to an interesting podcast recently, with Arvin from Glean, and he was talking about, like, essentially how everybody's gonna have access to the same information. You look at the Blue Matrix partnership, for example, with Perplexity. Everybody will have access to this kind of baseline of information, which is amazing. I think this is like, allows people to build entire businesses. It allows, the solo person to start running a hedge fund. However, the big value comes where a lot of these firms have 10 years of historical data they want to go and access. So the more data you can be capturing throughout the entire organization, both from a portfolio company perspective, a GP and LP level perspective, these are all things that you cannot take for granted. And I don't think this is going anywhere. So I will say, like, this is something I think is going to continue to permeate over the coming years. Um, and by capturing all this data, as the models continue to improve, you're going to basically have the best possible chance of succeeding by leveraging this technology.
Yeah, I look, the data aspect of this is just so paramount, and folks have said this a variety of ways, but whether you're a horizontal SaaS player, or you're vertical, or your average service business, like, start capturing more data, get it clean, get it integrated, so that you can really start to leverage it, because that is ultimately going to be a moat for many businesses moving forward versus the software products or the services they actually offer. And so that'll be a really interesting movement over the next several years. Let's move on to the second theme, going from agentic AI to ambient AI. Can Adam, can you define, like, what does that actually mean?
So way I kind of think through ambient AI is like agents that kind of live in your background 24/7 that are doing work when you sleep, when you wake up, that kind of throughout your workday. Um, you don't necessarily need to call on them to say, "Hey, go do this task." They're just kind of happening behind the scenes. I use these types of agents every day directly within like Perplexity comment. I say, who am I meeting with today? I say, can you create a consolidated list of, who I'm meeting with, find a most recent tweet about them or a LinkedIn post, find me research on the company that I'm meeting with. And like every day I have this almost like personal VA assistant who like lives in my inbox who just tells me, hey, here's something that you should be aware of the people you're meeting with. And this is something that's I think like ambient in the background. I'm not every day going and kicking it off saying at 6 a.m. go conduct research on who I'm meeting with. I set it and I forget it, and it happens now kind of on a daily basis. So I think this is kind of how to think through ambient AI. Um, as you maybe go apply to like private equity, as deals come in, or maybe there's, a big news release or something like that that happens on a company, these are data points that be pulled into, your financial model or maybe your decision making. So maybe you saw a deal 3 months ago, and there's been like a major breakthrough. Let's say it's a drug or like a net new drug, and there's a major breakthrough. You should be pinged automatically saying, "Hey, you guys took a look at XYZ company, and here's this major breakthrough that happened." And this is totally without you going on the internet or an analyst going and conducting research. This is something that's just happening in real time as you go about your workday. So something I'm very excited about. I think like this is kind of like the promise of like, was the promise of agentic always is just like, you give it a task, it's able just to do it time and time again. But I think the fact that like now this thing is like living and breathing and kind of like, your brain only has so much context. If you can have these like ambient agents that are just out there conducting research for you, out there, telling you in the morning, hey, here's who you're meeting with. Like this is a huge value add, I think, for, it doesn't matter how big your company is.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's so interesting. Like, you think of a deal process and some of the work we're doing with investment teams right now. Like, you may have 2, 4, 8 weeks to go through a deal, fully diligence it, build your models, etc. You've got docs, being added to the deal rooms or the data rooms all the time. Like, agents should just be picking these things up and refining some of your outputs along the way, whether it's your LBO, whether it's your IC materials. And I think this is the world we're moving to, where you've got agents effectively listening and acting on a bunch of these things. Same would be true for research. You've got market events that are happening real time, intraday, that should be impacting how you think about a deal, your investment case or your base case, and ultimately what your value creation plan is.
I think like just switching it back to like hedge funds for a second, like if you had an analyst who's just incredibly great at knowing like five particular equities, and you could ask him anything at any point throughout the day about these five equities, he'd be able to tell you every data point on them. You can think about these ambient agents in the same way, except they can do this over hundreds of equities. Is the goal. It's just any data point that comes in throughout the day, this now goes back into context. This is now something you can go and research. This is something that now becomes a living, breathing machine and you're not relying on this analyst having to be up 24/7, 365. So these systems are really exciting. I think we're still in the early stages of a lot of them, but we're starting to see okay, like the light is starting to shine through here in terms of okay, here's what the art of the possible is.
Adam, it's February 2026. What do we need to know right now on some of the biggest developments in AI?
One of the biggest things that happened over the past few months is Perplexity entered into a huge partnership with Blue Matrix, and this is like I think going to be the first of many that we're going to see go on in the space. I could see that Claude and OpenAI and Gemini going to traditional research providers like Tegas or AlphaSites, or maybe even going to Bloomberg directly and saying, "Hey, how can we query this decade plus of information that they've been gathering?" So this is really exciting, I think, for everybody in the space. because I think maybe finance professionals 2 years ago were using LLMs and they were getting results that I would say were inadequate. And now with the these types of partnerships, I think it's gonna be really exciting to kind of see how the space moves forward, and how finance professionals can actually start trusting LLMs to provide accurate, reliable research for them.
Yeah, it's an interesting partnership. I mean, Perplexity, just a fantastic technology. I think that's permeating a bunch of different industries and workflows. How do one of the things that's interesting, we deal a lot with investment teams, is part of this is only as good as the context you provide it, even if you're doing research. Like, what other developments are you seeing in terms of folks focusing on the data and the history of data that they actually have within their firms?
So I think going to like external provider like Blue Matrix is great because you're going to get basically an understanding of what's going on in the market. I think a lot of firms though that I've seen are have this like massive trove of data historically. So this might be in Snowflake, might be in some legacy applications, um, and they're trying to make sense of as great as it is having access to the Blue Matrix data. How do we actually make this internal data we've been collecting over the past decade plus useful for making investments? So I think over 2026, you're going to see a lot more firms leaning in, saying, okay, how do we actually make use of this data? How do I actually make sure that this is something that, we've been spending all this money, time, energy capturing this data. Let's actually make it useful. Let's actually have it lead to better decision making, have it lead to faster decision making. And ultimately, everybody says data backed decisions. Well, you got to start with the data first. So I think that's a piece that I'm really excited to kind of see how this permeates over the next year.
And I know, look, the way we build a lot of these products, we put a lot of measures in place to ensure that hallucinations don't get in front of the user. But I'm curious what you think.
Hallucinations are not going anywhere. It's not a solved problem by any means, and I don't think either of us would be sitting here right now if we could figure that one out completely. However, like the Perplexity Blue Matrix partnership does highlight that if you can get access to great data and make this available to a new set of users, which in this case finance professionals, and have the ability to query over it in a way that otherwise wasn't possible, it does open up entire new opportunities on how to actually leverage this data. I think from a search perspective alone it's huge. It's gonna be a huge opportunity to be able to go and say, okay, query historical research on any type of company through Blue Matrix. I think this is something that we're now seeing very much in the infancy stage. But as you have multiple providers, and in the same way, getting a bit nerdy here, but with LLMs, you can choose between different, web search providers. You could choose Exa, you could choose a bunch of different, web search providers there. You're gonna have the same opportunity to go say, okay, I want to go research Bloomberg. I want to go research Blue Matrix. I want to go research, any other, external vendors. And you're gonna be able to now, from a hallucination perspective, say, hey, here's the kind of variance that occurs between each one of these. Here's, Blue Matrix said, EBITDA was 11 million. We had Bloomberg say it was 11.2 million. Okay, let's go dig deeper and understand actually where the root of that data is. So I think being able to surface the most accurate information is one of the most important pieces. So I'm super excited about this partnership because now we're able to surface the most accurate information possible and not rely on something like a Yahoo Finance to go and pull data from.
It almost feels like you're at a competitive disadvantage if you're not leveraging these tools today. And it's so fascinating. There's a lot of news out there right now on like the compounding effects of leveraging these tools and leveraging newer versions of these tools.
I'm really excited for a bunch of these tools and kind of seeing how firms of all sizes, whether you're just like a solo, founder or solo person running a hedge fund, all the way to like the biggest firms in the world, end up leveraging this technology.
Yeah, it feels like it, like in most fields, and particularly in whether it's hedge funds, VC, or private equity, just generally private markets. Like you can be punching way above your weight right now with some of these tools, and you can have a really small team competing against firms with hundreds of individuals and hundreds of billions under management.
It's crazy. I was at this like hackathon a couple weeks ago, and I met this guy, and he's basically just stock trades every day, and he's just using Claude Deep Research. Like truly, he's on the $200 a month max plan. He's kicking off like dozens of these sessions per day, doing very in depth financial research. He has this entire methodology of like how he picks stocks and picks equities. And I look at him just like this is if he would have gone to Wall Street in the 90s saying, "Hey, I'm this guy who has access to all this information," probably would have gone and raised like a multi-billion-dollar fund, and now it's just some guy in Palo Alto in his basement. So it's really kind of interesting to kind of see this dynamic play out.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Yeah, we'll see as it evolves. Adam, it's awesome having you on here. Like always, like I think we talked through three really interesting themes in the space right now, like AI's getting deeply embedded into the investment research process, the fact that we're moving from just agentic AI to ambient AI, AI actually running in the background for much of our lives, let alone our workflows day to day, and then how it's transforming software development. I think this is one of the most interesting areas, and we see it day to day with our teams. But thank you so much for joining, Adam. Like always, we're excited for the next predictions from you.